Good afternoon. I think you've already met Davide Boerio, who's a researcher at the EURONEWS Project. I'm Brendan Dooley on the faculty at UCC, and I'm a principal investigator in the EURONEWS Project, which is funded by the Irish Research Council and hosted at University College Cork in collaboration with the Medici Archive Project in Florence. And you're all very welcome to this second in our series of Conversazioni. Let me remind you that the session, for those who just showed up, the session is being recorded. So if you don't feel like you want to be seen, you can turn off your video, and if you don't want to be heard, you can mute your mic. It's a good idea to mute your mic anyway when not speaking, so keep that in mind. It saves some bandwidth. And comments and questions you can make throughout today's session on the chat. In fact, there's already somebody on the chat. Oh, right, Sara Mansuti, another researcher on our project, has put into the chat the address, our web address for the EURONEWS project. Well, anyway, so what is the EURONEWS Project? It's an attempt to analyze and understand the birth of news, really, the first news sources, the first news publications, regular publications of news, which begin in the late Renaissance and continue up to the 18th century. Newsletter form, handwritten newsletters, they are the ancestors of printed gazettes and newspapers. There is a huge quantity of these in the archive in Florence, and so that's where our base of research is located, the base of our documents. Now, this EURONEWS project is not only about news, obviously, but it's also about early modern culture in general, and not only about early modern culture in general, but about historiography and about transdisciplinarity and about how our analyses may benefit from a very wide distribution of approaches to the documents we have. So we're working from a linguistic, a literature standpoint, a historical standpoint, and also taking into account sociology and feminist studies and many other, critical theory and many other approaches. And our guest today is Dr. Nicoletta Mandolini, who is a junior researcher at the Centro de Estudos de Comunicação e Sociedade at the Universidade do Minho in Portugal, where she's working on a project, sketch her story and make it popular using graphic narratives, Italian and Lusophone in feminist activism against gender violence. Okay, there you go. She's worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the Catholic Universität in Leuven, and she has a PhD from University College Cork, which was funded by the Irish Research Council, apparently. The doctoral project was about representation of gender-based violence and feminicide in contemporary Italian journalistic and literary narratives. She's published a number of articles, other works. She's also a member of the UCC research group called the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures. Her research interests include feminist theory, gender-based violence, Italian women writers, comics studies, feminist media studies, and transmedial storytelling. And I think bits and pieces of all of these aspects will be showing up in the discussion that we'll be having today. Her title, as you will see, is The Qualities of The Qualities of Qualitative Research in Discourse Analysis, Hybrid Literary Journalism as a Case Study. So fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us here. We're all very much anticipating this discussion. At the end of your slide presentation, we will begin a larger discussion which will bring in the two texts that you suggested as readings, the Papacarisi text on the new journalism and Donna Haraway's classic text on situated knowledges. So without any further hesitation, let's give the floor or the screen to Nicoletta Mandolini. And once again, thank you very much. And I think you can start sharing your screen right now.
Thank you, Professor Dooley, and thank you, Davide Boerio, for inviting me here, inviting me to participate in this exciting series of talks. I think, as Davide said before, that this is a precious occasion because we're all to some extent confined in our houses. I'm speaking from a country that from tomorrow, tonight at midnight, will enter into lockdown. So we're all deprived of our possibility to exchange knowledge, to confrontation, you know, that fruitful confrontation that we are used to in academia. I would like to anticipate that I am not a scholar, as the description that Brendan Dooley gave about my scholarly background. I'm not a scholar in journalism studies. I come from literature mainly, and I'm interested in comics at the moment. But I did work on journalism. I will tell you more about this in the next few minutes. But I think it is important to point out this from the very beginning, because I want to tell you that the aim of this seminar, of my seminar, is not to present original research or groundbreaking research on the topic of qualitative analysis. The aim is to outline the theoretical principles that lie behind the practice of qualitative research. And I also have the aim to present some of the features of qualitative analysis by making reference to my own research experience in the use of qualitative discourse analysis in particular, and as well in the analysis of a specific type of hybrid journalism that is called graphic journalism. But we will see that in a while. I would like to start, and the first slide tells a lot about it, with a distinction between qualitative and quantitative analysis that I suppose is particularly needed in order to start our discussion. I propose here a quotation that is taken from a manual of qualitative research in the field of psychology and mental health studies, which of course differs significantly from the area of research we locate ourselves in, which is, in my case, literary studies, journalistic studies, but in general that of communication studies, let's say that. However, I think that the points that the authors of the referenced manual can be generalized and can be easily related to all qualitative and quantitative methods. So we'll start reading the quotation, pretty long one. Qualitative research addresses the question of what. Knowing what something is entails a conceptualization of the matter under investigation as a whole and in its various parts, the way these parts are related and organized as a whole, and how the whole is similar to and different from other things. Knowing what something is may also involve the conceptualization of its how, its process and temporal unfolding in time. The construction of theories, hypothetical explanation, prediction, and measurement of a subject matter presupposes qualitative knowledge, that is, knowledge of the basic characteristics of the subject matter. Knowledge of the what may be implicit or explicit, uncritically assumed or carefully established, and informally or formally acquired. In the history of the sciences that concern human mental life, great attention has been devoted to the rigorous specification of procedures for measurement and quantitative analysis, and the rigorous specification, and the qualitative descriptive procedures have received far less attention. However, in and of itself, measurement tells us only magnitude, and even when many measurements are made with the best instruments and rationally analyzed with the most sophisticated statistical procedure, they do not themselves provide qualitative knowledge of what is being measured. Therefore, a different kind of research and analysis, research about what a subject matter is and all its real-world complexity, is a necessary foundation and complement to quantitative research. So from this quotation, we can tell what is qualitative analysis or qualitative knowledge, as the author defines it, and quantitative knowledge or quantitative analysis. Qualitative knowledge is determined by the study of the quality of the study of the characteristics of the object of research. And what they say here is that research questions that are related to qualitative analysis usually start with the expression what, or with the expression how. Quantitative knowledge and quantitative analysis is pretty different, because it's a study that is based on the measurement of the available data. So quantitative methodologies usually result in research questions that contain the expression I add from the scholars: how much, how many. Okay, I try to summarize these ideas in a few research questions that pertain my personal research, that as Professor Brendan Dooley and Davide Boeri first said, concerned for a long time. My doctoral dissertation was on the analysis of representations of femicide, so lethal violence against women, in Italian journalistic and literary narratives. My analysis was a qualitative analysis, okay? So research questions that were related to my research were the two research questions that I showcased here in the slide. The first one is a what one, okay? What is the representation of a femicide perpetrator offered by the Italian press? This is an example of the few research questions I try to answer to. Another example is, how is the representation of the murderer as mad employed, and what are the discursive effects of this representation? We will not go into detail now, but we will see better later what the hypothetical answers to these questions are. But for now, it is important to see that, of course, these questions start with what or with how, okay? So they investigate the object in a direct way. While researches that have been conducted on the same topic, on the journalistic, for example, representation of femicide in the Italian context or beyond, and that use quantitative analysis, started with how much. An example of this research question is the question that I propose here. How much is the representative frame of the perpetrator as mad used by the Italian journalist who covered femicide from 2012 to 2015? So these are particularly different questions, and I suppose that these sample questions highlight other major differences that contribute to shaping quantitative and qualitative analysis as distinct and as well as opposed methodologies. What we see from these questions is that qualitative analysis is necessarily based on a limited amount of data that allows an in-depth analysis, but prevents, for example, the researcher from making generalization or from considering her or his analysis as relevant from a statistical perspective. For example, I couldn't tell, like somebody who does quantitative analysis, that I couldn't ask in my question what is the representation of femicide in Italian newspapers. That would have been too much general for a qualitative analysis, because a qualitative analysis necessarily implies an in-depth study, a complicated and not simplified study that cannot be statistically relevant. This is possible on the other side in quantitative research, as the questions show, because when we ask ourselves how much is the representative frame of the perpetrator as mad used by Italian journalists to cover femicide from 2012 to 2015, this of course implies a generalization. So quantitative analysis generally employs big data sets or big databases. These might allow generalization, and this might produce a research that can be considered statistically relevant. I would like to tell you a bit more about the emergence of qualitative research. How did it emerge? Qualitative research emerged back in the 1980s, when the effects of post-structuralist thinking and the constructionist philosophy impacted on research methodologies, thus allowing the proliferation of qualitative methods in areas such as ethnographic, social, psychological, linguistic research. This in turn shed light on the importance of the research positioning. We will see that better looking at Donna Haraway, the text that on situated knowledge, the text that I suggested as a reading, and contributed, of course, to the denunciation of objectivity in research as the ideological universalization of an hegemonic perspective that usually coincides with that of the white male heteronormative researcher. So in other words, the emergence of qualitative methods gave voice to a wide spectrum of new and non-hegemonic researchers who started portraying their scholarly work as the result of their marginalized positioning and unmasked the false objectivity of those who presented their hegemonic perspectives as scientific. These are the years, the 80s, when, for example, feminist ethnography emerged. Feminist ethnography that differs significantly from traditional ethnography, because the feminist ethnographer who conducted research explicitly positioned herself or positions herself and explicitly makes reference to her own process of collecting data, of establishing relationships with the object of study. To some extent, it overcomes the objective dynamic, the objective methodology. These are the years of feminist historiography, when feminist historiography emerged in the Anglophone world, but as well as in Italy. So when feminist historians denounced the objectivity, the supposed objectivity with which history, with the big H, the capital H, was shaped by male historians and was detrimental to some extent to women who were excluded as figures, as subjects who participated in historical dynamics. These are also the years when the so-called mixed methodologies or mixed methods emerged as a gold standard, because, of course, with the emergence of qualitative analysis, even quantitative scholars who adopted quantitative analysis were suggested to some extent to include a qualitative methodology, precisely because of the questioning of the principle of objectification. However, I think that quantitative research that relies on the hard traditional idea of objectivity never really lost its hegemonic role in some research areas. In journalism studies, for example, the emergence of the methodology of critical discourse analysis, which is shaped on post-structuralist theories that portray discourse with Foucault as the battlefield where dominant and non-dominant positioning struggle for obtaining relevance. So critical discourse analysis has been dominated, especially now that digital humanities have acquired such a scholarly relevance, by corpus linguistics and by the imperative of quantitative research, to the extent that quantitative critical discourse analysis nowadays is critical discourse analysis nowadays is a rare beast, which finds its legitimacy only in mixed method studies, where it complements quantitative readings. Again, I think these can open a lot of discussions, this statement, and I will be happy to discuss that later. And I will make reference to my own research and my own peer review process, the peer review process that resulted in some of my publications in order to offer even more ideas on that topic. I would like, because as you might have understood, I am a feminist scholar, and for feminist scholars, the idea of positioning themselves is particularly important. So I would like to let you know what my scholarly position is. And this is not to showcase my work or to make myself known, but it is, of course, to clarify that what I'm saying during this seminar is the product of my scholarly location that happens to be hybrid, happens to be eccentric. Even though it is, of course, clearly shaped on the adoption and employment of qualitative analysis, on qualitative methodologies more than quantitative methodologies. Why do I define my position as hybrid or eccentric? Because my disciplinary background, some of my current interest as well, and my theoretical positioning as feminist, all inequivocally highlights my dedication to the principles of subjective interpretation and qualitative analysis. However, I am confronting myself with research areas and research fields where quantitative methodologies are nowadays dominant. So this is why my position is hybrid and eccentric. So my background, as you can see from the slide, is in literary studies. I graduated in lettere in Italy, so in Italian literature, and my main occupation as a scholar during the years of my education was the analysis of literary representations of femicide produced in the Italian context. That was the topic of my PhD dissertation, for example. So qualitative analysis was not even a question for me. It was an imperative because the need of a close or the need of an in-depth reading of literary text is in literary studies considered obvious, given the semiotic, semantic, and narratological complexity of the works that we analyze. In recent years, from the 2000s, another idea, that of the distant reading produced by the Italian scholar Franco Moretti, emerged in the area of literary study. It consists in the application of computational and quantitative methods to the analysis of literary text. Again, we can discuss about this, but I have the feeling that this type of analysis, this methodology, is particularly marginal and accessory in literary studies today. So, in relation to my background, this is not something that ever came up in my literary study studies work. My literary studies work was qualitative, completely, totally qualitative. Another thing that makes me a qualitative analysis scholar is my current interest in comic studies. My current project, Sketch Your Story, Make It Popular, I provided the link to my website in the first slide of this presentation that if you want I can share with you afterwards. So my current project is aims at investigating the representations of gender-based violence in graphic narratives. When we talk about graphic narratives, we talk about comics, illustrations with the textual dimension, so vignettes, for example, and graphic novels. So I'm interested in the representation of gender-based violence in graphic narratives, and I'm interested in understanding how feminist activism employs graphic narratives in order to denounce sexist abuse. This study, which is inherently qualitative, and I will tell you more about that later, also involves a study of graphic journalism, which I will refer to later and which might be interesting in this context. Comics, even more than literature, are complex at a semiotic and a narratological level, which makes close reading necessary, in my opinion. Comics are based on the interplay of words and images, which problematizes the reading process and implies a highly subjective interpretative practice. We will talk more about that at the end of the presentation, but for now I think it is enough to say that comic scholars have highlighted the medium's propensity to convey the impression of a highly subjective type of narrative, because drawing is based on the visual practice of iconicity, which differs significantly, for example, from indexical practices used in media such as photography, where the relationship between the represented objects and the representation itself is perceived as direct or non-mediated. So if the process of creating graphic narratives is clearly creative, is clearly subjective, I believe that the process of reading them as well, even from a scholarly perspective, cannot but be qualitative and explicitly subjective as well. But as I said to you, my position is hybrid, my position is eccentric. I'm in fact interested in media and discourses, and I'm currently employed in a research center that is called Centro de Estudos sobre Comunicação e Sociedade, which means Center of Studies on Communication and Society, which, as the name suggests, is particularly interested in discourses and in communication and sociology, all areas that employ even quantitative methodologies. I would like now to go to Donna Haraway, to her situated knowledges, because part of my position, I anticipated that, is characterized by me being a feminist scholar. And being a feminist scholar is not irrelevant when we talk about qualitative or quantitative methodologies, when we talk about objectivity and subjectivity. And I will try to explain you why. So as Donna Haraway points out, feminist scholarship struggled to find its position in the issue of subjectivity versus objectivity, because for a long time it remained, feminist scholarship remained tied to the existing polarization between the idea of a disembodied scientific objectivity and that of social constructionism. So on the one side, feminists couldn't align with those who believe in the possibility of conducting research without giving an account of their inevitably partial view. and present their research findings as universally valid, thus avoiding confrontations with other scholarly positions. So they couldn't align with those who had the idea of a disembodied scientific objectivity. They could not align with this trend because this trend is precisely the one that dominated research for centuries. This is precisely the one that universalized the male heteronormative perspective and the one that contributed to the process of simplification that excluded women from the game. On the other side, though, feminists couldn't deeply endorse the social constructionist idea according to which everything is discursive. Reality in itself does not exist, and claims of objectivity are simply ways of hide discursive power relationships. Despite the presence of some common standpoints with the social constructionists, such as the doubt over the researcher's ability to provide a comprehensive and impartial depiction of a specific phenomenon, feminists could not unanimously agree with social constructionist idea of reality as an entirely discursive entity, because these could undermine the process of denunciation of actual and real gender discriminations, and this could contribute to the dismissal of women's direct experiences of abuse and subjugation. So, because of this incapacity of feminists to align with the two poles of the dichotomy of what Don Haraway called attempting dichotomy on the question of subjectivity, feminists, and Don Haraway was one of the first to do so, conceptualized a third way. The third way is the one of the so-called situated knowledge, of the so-called embodied objectivity. So by taking into consideration the idea of partiality of vision, according to which all visions, which is to say all insights on reality, are inevitably embodied and personal, Haraway introduces the idea of feminist objectivity, which is particularly different from the one of the traditional idea of objectivity, the scientific idea of objectivity shaped on the scientific method. Feminist objectivity is an idea that allows to continue taking into consideration feminist confidence in reality as a complex, highly stratified entity, while questioning at the same time universalizing tendencies that ultimately result in simplification. Feminist objectivity relies on the principle of situatedness, of positioning. It promotes scholarly analysis that resort to qualitative methodologies in order to present findings as the result of inquiries that dialogate with the reality of the phenomenon from a partial and always explicitly located perspective. I think that the fruitful paradox of feminist objectivity applies also to the specific sub-area of research that coincides with my scholarly expertise, which is that of studies on gender-based violence and its representation. In fact, when we do scholarly work on the socially relevant topic of patriarchal abuse on women and on non-heteronormative subjects more generally, positioning the relativity of the researcher's case is an ethical imperative, in my opinion, and is an ethical imperative that allows to avoid dangerous reductionism in describing a phenomenon that originates precisely from the simplification of patriarchal categories and dichotomies. To explain you this, how gender-based violence originates from simplification of patriarchal categories and dichotomies, I can say that gender violence works for the maintenance of gender roles, of rigid gender roles, and rigid gender roles that divide rigidly between a dominant masculinity and a passive femininity. So any reductionism needs to be avoided when research on gender violence is conducted. Otherwise, we risk to rhetorically confirm the categories and the distinction, the dichotomies that from which gender violence itself originates. However, I deeply think that a certain degree of objectivity is required when it comes to the study of gender-based violence, because it forces us to remain faithful to the description of a phenomenon that is many times contested and negated by patriarchal discourse. Let's think, for example, about the discussions that every year on the 25th of November, which is the International Day dedicated to the elimination of violence against women, people on social media, on journalistic platforms, on TV. So the contestation of the numbers that are related to gender-based violence and the discourse, the patriarchal discourse that insists on the fact that gender-based violence actually doesn't exist. So there is this to some extent, even still hegemonic discourse against gender-based violence that needs to be challenged. And in order to challenge this discourse, we as feminist scholars need to rely on a certain degree of objectivity. Otherwise, our denunciation cannot be heard. So these criticisms and these contradictions, which can be resolved according to Donna Haraway's idea of feminist objectivity, or with an always explicitly situated intervention. So this criticism is well exemplified, I think, by the objections that the feminist philosopher Teresa de Lauretis, I propose a quote from Teresa de Lauretis here in the slide, she moved some criticism to Michel Foucault's theories on sexual and family violence. According to Foucault, crimes such as rape, sexual violence, should be considered simply violent crimes because considering them as sexual or as gender-related reinforce, according to Foucault, the patriarchal gender rhetoric that produced them. So Foucault's standpoint stems from the social constructionist belief that reality is completely shaped by discourse, and that consequently discursive operations are the one to be used in order to challenge a phenomenon of discrimination. Teresa de Lauretis cleverly reflects this view and reflects on this view and legitimately affirms that Foucault's theory results from his male gender positioning, a positioning that prevents him from recognizing women's embodied experience of violence as eminently real and as eminently concrete. So in other words, women who have always suffered the sadly real consequences of phenomena like family violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse, rape, they do not have the luxury of labeling what they have lived on their skin as discursive. And they need to recognize the objective, the position dimension of gender violence. So this shed a light on the importance of situated analysis, as well as on the need to find a third way between the rigid scientific objectivity and radical reductivism. So now I will move to a concrete example that is taken from my limited, but I suppose emblematic work and experience on doing qualitative analysis in the field of journalism studies. I recently published an article called Femminicidio prima e dopo, un'analisi qualitativa della copertura giornalistica dei casi Stefania Noce e Sara Di Pietrantonio, on the Italian peer-reviewed journal Problemi dell'Informazione, which is one of the most prominent academic journals in journalism studies in Italy. The article, which is taken from research that I conducted during my PhD dissertation, aimed at analyzing in a qualitative way two specific coverages of femicide cases. One was that of Stefania Noce, which happened in 2011, and the other one was that of Sara Di Pietrantonio, which happened in 2016. The cases were similar. They were both really young victims who were murdered by their ex-partners, and they were murdered in an effort way, in a really violent way. Stefania Noce was stabbed repeatedly, while Sara Di Pietrantonio was strangled, and after that she was set on fire by the ex-partner. But there is something that makes the two cases to some extent different, at least in the coverage, the journalistic coverage, which is the time when they happened. 2011 was the year just before what I call the mainstreaming of the discourse, of the feminist discourse on femicide, which is the process, of course, of mainstreaming, of popularization of feminist theories on femicide. Is the mainstreaming, according to my research, happened in 2012, which is when journalists, politicians started to use the term feminicidio, which was previously only employed in the small niche of feminist discourse. Nowadays, even a kid knows what feminicidio means in Italy. So Stefania Noce's case was previous to the mainstreaming of femicide, 2011, while Sara Di Pietrantonio was happened after the mainstreaming. I thought that it could be interesting to compare two cases and the coverage of two cases that happened one before and one after, in order to see what was the impact that this mainstreaming, so the popularization of the discussion of femicide, was on the coverage of femicide itself. There are some feminist scholars in journalism studies in Italy recognize that there are some issues in the representation of femicide. These issues, for example, are victim blaming, so the tendency to blame the victim for what happened. This tendency happens with some specific typologies of victims, mostly victims who are not hegemonic, let's say that, or women who conduct that was not considered exemplar in patriarchal terms. Another tendency is, and opposite one, is the idealization of the murdered women, which happens on the contrary when the victim is hegemonic. So when the victim represents the model of femininity that patriarchal discourse conveys. Other issues related to the representation of femicide that scholars in Italy and beyond noticed is, for example, the justification of the perpetrator and the portrayal of the killer as deviant, as somebody who deviates from the norm, which is used to exclude the perpetrator from the realm of normative masculinity. So he's a deviant, he's not a normal man, which in other words means femicide is not something that is related to masculinity. Femicide is not something that is related to our culture. Femicide is the result of a deviant behavior, which of course excuses masculinity and doesn't allow us as readers and as readers to recognize femicide as a social problem. I sent my article for the peer review process, and despite my article having a clearly qualitative dimension, a qualitative dimension that is showcased by the title, Un'analisi qualitativa, a qualitative analysis, and I also focus on two case studies, I don't generalize, I cannot generalize, and and in my article I repeatedly stated that I couldn't make generalization because of the explicitly qualitative dimension of my research. So notwithstanding this clear qualitative dimension, one of the peer reviewers considered the analysis incomplete or not scholarly relevant because it lacked a quantitative dimension, which testifies, in my opinion, to the aforementioned imperative of qualitative and statistical analysis in the field. So the reviewer wanted me to provide the exact number, for example, and percentage of the recording of specific discourses tendencies in the corpus of the articles that I selected. I decided to welcome the reviewer's suggestion because I wanted my article to be published, of course, and because I realized that the inclusion of a quantitative analysis would have given much more credibility to my work in the context of the scholarly community I was addressing with my article. But while implementing the quantitative analysis, I noticed that the improvement in clarity and credibility, which is a result of quantitative analysis, came at a cost. In fact, the inclusion of numbers and inclusion of percentages made my positioning or the necessarily subjective dimension of my interpretation transparent or implicit, which for my feminist background and for my qualitative analysis background is problematic. In particular, I realized that behind the numbers that I provided lied a series of small choices that I made to categorize the articles according to specific discursive labels that could not be made explicit. For example, some articles presented a nonlinear narrative that highlighted the complexity of a switching discourse that, despite being still trapped in the practice of reproducing patriarchal ideology, was slowly coming to terms with the mainstreaming, the popularization of feminist counter-discourse on the topic. Notwithstanding this complexity, I had, because I had to do quantitative analysis as well, to assign a specific category to each article, which resulted in the obliteration of my interpretative process and in the inevitable simplification of the semantic and discursive stratification of the text. Of course, I provided the criteria that I used in order to conduct my quantitative analysis, but the providing this criteria was not enough because there were many other small choices that I had to make for the categorization that I could not make explicit. But luckily, qualitative analysis was still there as a very crucial aspect of my methodology, and was there to assist me in the presentation of the textual complexity of my corpus. In particular, quotations, in my opinion, are very important, are a very important part in qualitative analysis studies and in the publications that rotate around the qualitative analysis, because they allow to make direct reference to the text and they allow to explain your interpretative position by implicitly dialoguing with the interpretation of those who are reading the article and who can of course, they have their own idea, who can read the quotation themselves. So I provided here in the slide a few examples that unfortunately I had to translate into English in order to be clear to everybody. Of course, the original is in Italian, and there might be some small differences. But if you're interested in the Italian original, I can provide it to you. All these quotes are taken from the second murder, the second femicide, which is the femicide of Sara Di Pietrantonio, happened after the mainstreaming of femicide in 2016. The perpetrator of Sara Di Pietrantonio, the killer's name was Vincenzo Paduano. You have a quote that is bigger than the others, which is the one that we will focus on. I will read it before starting. But Vincenzo is an obsessive man, a man who could not accept his ex-partner's new relationship with a former schoolmate. Paduano's profile on Facebook describes a guy in love, surrounded by bunches of red roses, while he's with the poor Sara. But it also describes a clearly disturbed man. As cover picture, Paduano chose a group of sheep. At the center of the image, a black one surrounded by the others. Paduano must have felt like that on Saturday when he decided to kill Sara in Via della Magliana. Why I decided to include this quote in the article? Because in my opinion, it showcases the switch that occurred between Stefania Noce's case and Sara Di Pietrantonio's one, so the pre-mainstreaming and the post-mainstreaming. there is something in particular that showcases this change, which is the recognition of the perpetrator's agency, which is something on which feminist discourse insisted a lot, and which journalists, after the mainstreaming, to some extent assimilated, in my opinion. Before, in the coverage of Stefania Noce's case, was pretty clear that the perpetrator was not recognized as responsible. So there were some linguistic and discursive examples that could highlight how the journalist tended to deprive the perpetrator of his responsibility. Here, in the last sentence, we have an active verb, an active and a real explicit verb. He decided to kill Sara in Via della Magliana. Is an active verb that expresses choice, expresses will. Before, just to give you an idea, in Noce's cases, it was frequent, for example, the use of the passive form. That scholarly works on femicide and on representations of femicide have identified as a strategy to blame the victim and to excuse or to justify the perpetrator. I give you an example taken from Stefania Noce's case. The girl's decision to abruptly end their relationship unleashed the murderous madness of Loris Gagliano. So the inversion of the subject, which is determined by the use of the passive form here, is what blames the victim and excuses the perpetrator. This is not used in this quote where the active form clearly identifies Vincenzo Paduano as responsible, as somebody who lucidly decided to kill Sara. Okay, this is one aspect, and this is one aspect that, to be honest, it could have been recognized even with a quantitative analysis. There is a bunch of quantitative analysis on this topic that quantitative discourse analysis that work on specific words and on their syntactic relevance in order to understand what are the discursive tendencies of the article. But this quotation, in my opinion, is way more complex than that. So we can see that there is a recognition by the journalist of the agency of the killer. At the same time, though, there is still a reference to what scholars in representations of femicide call the frame of romantic love. So Vincenzo Paduano is described as a man in love. He couldn't accept that the relationship with his ex-partner ended. Is a guy in love surrounded by benches of red roses, etc., etc. The frame of romantic love is analyzed by two Italian scholars, Gius and Lalli, as a specific technique used in order to deprive the perpetrator of his responsibility. Because, of course, when we associate a crime, an act of killing with love, to some extent we justify him as a jealous guy, as a guy who was suffering for love. So there is the recognition of the agency, but at the same time, there is the frame of romantic love. Also, there is another thing that only qualitative analysis, in my opinion, and an in-depth analysis of the quotation could allow to understand, which is the portrayal of the perpetrator as deviant. So Vincenzo Paduano is a guy in love, but he's also an obsessive man. He's also a disturbed man. I told you before that scholarly works on femicide representation recognize this frame of the of the perpetrator as mad, of the perpetrator as crazy, as affected by mental illness, as a technique used in order to portray him as somebody who didn't know what to do, who to some extent was not responsible for the action. In my opinion, here there is a switch. The frame of craziness, the frame of madness that is definitely present is not used to deprive the man of his responsibility, because there is a clear idea of responsibility that is showcased by the last sentence of the quotation. The reference to craziness is employed here to portray the perpetrator as deviant, as somebody who deviates from the norm, as the image of the black sheep suggests. So as a way to exclude the perpetrator from the realm of humanity, from the realm of masculinity, so to portray femicide not as a social problem. This is confirmed by the other two quotations that are included here in the slide, where journalists talk about a lucid madness of that ex-boyfriend who set on fire the body of her daughter, which is impossible to understand. So a craziness that is lucid, so is deliberate, but is impossible to understand, so is not human, is the fruit of a deviant act. The other quote is, it is clear that we are dealing with highly disturbed personalities that psychiatrists define as sociopathic. And I say this not for absolving or finding justifications, but because we should not consider this case as paradigms of contemporary masculinity. Precisely why I say that, it's not for labeling Paduano as irresponsible for what he did. The responsibility is still there, the idea of responsibility is still clear, but Paduano is labeled as deviant, as somebody who does not mirror, who does not conform to the paradigm of contemporary masculinity, which in turn, of course, exonerates masculinity from the responsibility of femicide, while feminists say precisely the contrary. Feminists say that femicide is the result of tendencies of hegemonic masculinity. Okay, so this just to try to understand together with you how complex some of the parts of the corpus analyzed are, and how necessary, in my opinion, is the qualitative analysis. That allow us, of course, to consider different aspects and not to collapse everything into one single categorization. The next thing I would like to do is to talk to you about new directions in journalism studies. That, in my opinion, showcase the need for a qualitative analysis, for an analysis that takes complex text seriously. I gave you a reading by this researcher called Papacarissi, is an article published in 2015, which analyzes new forms of subjective and affective journalism, new forms of journalism that are produced and are used at the same time. From here, the analogism that Papacarissi uses, which is that of produce that I reproduced in the slide, which employ these new forms of subjective and affective journalism employ different type of different tendencies of creation, reproduction, rebroadcasting, and even remediation that emerged as a phenomenon in recent years, following events, for example, such as the so-called Arab Spring, during which participants to the demonstrations contributed directly to the production and to the consumption of as well of news, which clearly made the process of producing news a highly subjective one, as opposed to the traditionally objective journalistic practice. In my opinion, the increase in the level of subjectivity in the studied phenomenon, and in the phenomenon studied by Papacarissi, needs to correspond to the implementation of a qualitative methodology that respects the complexity of the researched object. So if the object is subjective, the research needs to be subjective as well. Another tendency that emerged during the 60s and 70s, but continues to be particularly important, is that of the so-called positioned or subjective journalistic inquiries, or if you want to call it with another name, literary journalism. Of course, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the idea of the new journalism, of the phenomenon of the new journalism, which started in the United States in the 60s and the 70s with authors such as Tom Wolfe, Truman Capote, Norman Mailer. But this is not the only phenomenon that exists. In Italy, the genre of reportage narrativo, the narrative reportage, which mixes literary and journalistic forms, literary and journalistic styles, is particularly relevant even today. Another thing on which I would like to focus a bit more now is the emergence of new forms of hybrid journalism, such as graphic journalism, on which I will focus now, and video journalism. These are hybrid journalism forms that are based on multimodal representative practices, which is to say, representative practice that put together two or more modes. In the case of graphic journalism, the written and the writing, the textual and the image, the visual dimension are essential. I will talk to you a bit about graphic journalism, which is emerging in the last few years. One of the most prominent authors of graphic journalism is the comic artist Joe Sacco, who published inquiries on Palestine, Lebanon, the Balkans. Everything is drawn. Everything is presented in a comics or graphic novels format. The genre of graphic journalism is very important in the area of gender violence representations. In the corpus of works that I'm studying now for my research project, there are a few graphic journalism works on gender-based violence. For example, in the Italian context, there are three works. One is called Il Mondo di Aisha, which is a graphic novel on the an Italian graphic novel on the situation of discrimination, structural discrimination and violence suffered by women in Yemen, which is the adaptation into comics of a photo reportage. Other two works are can be ascribed to the area of digital comics because they are published exclusively online. And are two works. One is called Povere Venere, Poor Venuses, on the sex trafficking in the streets of Bologna. The other one is called Pensavo fosse amore. I thought it was love, by an important Italian comic artist called Alice Milani, and is let's say a journalistic trip in one of the women's shelter that in Italy struggle against gender violence and host women who suffer gender violence. But this genre of the graphic journalism is particularly prominent at an international level as well. And there are a few a few examples. One of these is La Lucha, that I will talk to you about in the next few minutes. What is important to say about graphic journalism is precisely what we said about comic studies before, which is based on the interplay of words and images. And for that, it implies a subjective position of the author, of those who create the graphic journalism, that is given by the drawing, which is perceived in our culture as subjective, as something that is creative, as something that is not objective in itself, which unveils, of course, the dynamics of subjectivity, but at the same time, graphic journalism and graphic novels, autobiographical graphic novels in particular, have another important feature, because the author, the drawer, the person who draws the graphic novel or the comics, presents himself or herself in an objective way. We can see him, okay, or we can see her. We can see himself from the outside. This happens a lot, for example, in Joe Sacco. And this interplay of subjective drawing but presenting his or her image of the author as objective, of course, unveils the dynamics through which journalists present their narrative as objective, and implicitly criticize it, and criticize even the distinction between the rigid distinction between objectivity and subjectivity, in the same way as Donna Haraway criticized that. It's not a case that graphic journalists rely on the idea of vision, which is really important in situated knowledges in the article of Donna Haraway, because according to Haraway, vision is what challenges really rigid distinctions between objectivity and subjectivity, is what highlights that the gaze always starts from a particular position, is never unpositioned. So just to conclude, I would like to introduce you to La Lucha, the story of Lucha Castro and human rights in Mexico, which is a graphic journalism example authored by John Sack and Adam Shapiro and published in 2015 by Verso. This book is about a journalistic inquiry in Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua and in the city of Ciudad Juárez, which is sadly famous for the enormous quantity of killings of women and disappearance of women that happen that have happened there since 1993. This graphic journalism example is focused on the activities of Lucha Castro, who is a human rights activist who worked a lot with victims of femicide and with parents and mothers of victims of femicide. And what we can see here, like my aim here is just to show you how complex graphic journalism works are and how necessary, because these works are complex at a narratological and at a semiotic level, how necessary qualitative analysis is. So I talked before about the position of the author in graphic narratives. Here, the position of the author is even more complex because there is a double author in this graphic journalism work. There is the drawer and there is the journalist. So this obviously furtherly complicates the dynamics of objective versus subjective narration that I described before. There is in particular a switching perspective that is clear in these pages. The switching perspective include an objective perspective that potentially coincides with that of the cartoonist in the first panel, for example. Then the perspective switches to the perspective of the journalist in the second panel, third and fourth panel, Then it switches again to that of Norma, with the woman that is drawn and is portrayed here, with is one another of the human rights activists in Mexico that are interviewed by the journalist. So basically, this switching perspective furtherly complicates the idea of objectivity and subjectivity. Another thing that is particularly complex, in my opinion, in this text is the interplay of words and images, because they work together to describe gender violence, and at the same time, they work together to overcome its effects. The effects of gender violence here are, in this case, is the disappearance or murder of the woman. So if we look, for example, at panel 2, 3, and 4 of these 2 pages that I propose in the slide, we can see that the text describes the situation of violence, of murder and disappearance, by telling the story of violence that affected Norma, whose daughter Paloma went missing. So the text describes the absence of the woman. On the contrary, the image portrays Paloma as present, because the young woman's picture, which is presented in panel 3, is included in the map of other murdered women and other disappeared women in the state of Chihuahua. But it becomes, in the following page, an independent image that is juxtaposed to that of the living mother Norma. And in so doing, the author gives the idea to the reader that, or the impression of Paloma's presence, which can be interpreted as a strategy, of course, to creatively oppose the femicide, or as a strategy to overcome its consequences in the realm of the representation, or as a technique to affirm or reaffirm Paloma's subjectivity and Paloma's personhood, precisely the same subjectivity and personhood that were negated with the act of violence. So we can see here that images and words contradict themselves in order to problematize the meaning that is conveyed by the graphic narrative. In this other image here, this other 2 page, we can see that words and images, though, not only contradict themselves, but in graphic narratives, as scholars notice, they also work to complement themselves, to emphasize themselves, and to convey a stronger message. So this is the case of the last panel reproduced here in the slide, where Norma talks to the journalist about her experience of isolation from her family, which was made necessary, of course, after the threatenings that she received for her activity as a human rights activist. She speaks about, in particular, the forced distance from her son, which she could not see growing up. The son's absence is conveyed by the text, but is also reproduced by the drawing, which resorts to the image of the empty armchair to represent the missing person. So words and images in graphic narratives can be conflicting, contradict each other to create a complex meaning, or they can complement each other. So I hope that these complexities of multimodal journalism, journalistic narratives, show the importance of qualitative analysis. And I hope that this brief example will stimulate a reflection on the qualities of qualitative positioned and open research, and shed light on the risk of an exclusively objective, in a traditional way, research. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nicoletta, for this very detailed and very wide-ranging presentation on many of your cases and very much of your work. For the discussion portion, we actually have promised to bring things to a close around 6 p.m. So, but I guess in view of things, we may be able to go over a little bit. I see as people are thinking of intervening, areas that you've talked about so far involve your cases, as well as your methodologies, fascinating discussion of those, the theory behind the methodologies, and also feminist theory in general, and the intervention of the great Donna Haraway, and finally the goal, which you sort of talk about in a sort of behind the scenes kind of way, because the subcurrent, obviously, of what you're doing is about emancipation and equality, that issues, social and cultural issues connected with where women are situated in our cultures and in our societies. So all of these areas demand I think, rather deep discussions, and I think maybe we could start. Maybe I could start. I'm looking at the at our chat. So people are able, of course, since we have a relatively small audience, people are able to intervene just by shouting or raising their hand. So that's okay. Or if they prefer, they can also use the chat to write in a question. But an issue that occurred to me very much in connection with what Donna Haraway was trying to accomplish, and how you are channeling in a way some of her basic ideas into a renewed look at a qualitative approach. It occurred to me the question about not setting aside let's say, for instance, non-Western realities, which may be particular sticking points in terms of where femicide and violence against women and so on are concerned, in especially in cases where there are, for instance, religious laws in play that channel behavior into certain kinds of categories. So it's exciting and inspiring to see how this can play out in societies that we're very familiar with, say European societies, the American reality, and so on. It would be interesting to see a little bit how this qualitative approach and so on might be extended to places where journalism has a much more fraught existence. But that's more of a comment than a question, because I actually prefer questions that really deal with material that you're focusing on yourself, rather than, let's say, ulterior implications that other researchers might want to torment themselves with. So a question, for instance, from my side would be elaborating on, for you, a qualitative approach which you have shown us basically appears in your results. My question would be, how do you go about the research which gives us these very impressive results? So basically, what is your strategy? Where do you get the material, and what do you do with it? So this is something that's of extreme concern, I'd say, to many of the researchers in our audience, which is the day-to-day research processes that we're using. So for instance, at UCC, you may be aware that we have training in en vivo, which is, I don't know whether you took the course, but it's billed as, you did? Oh my goodness. Okay.
And I used Envivo for my qualitative analysis.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Envivo is a software for qualitative data analysis. Yeah.
Indeed. So what I'm saying is, it will be interesting to see a little bit more behind the scenes, how you go about it.
Okay. Of course, it really depends on the material. As you see, I worked on different types of text. I worked with literary text a lot. I'm working a lot with comics. These are different type of things, type of materials. These are long texts that require a strategy, a kind of methodology that I simply draw from my literary studies background. What I do when I have to analyze a book or a graphic novel is to read it, reread it again, label it, do some coding with, really rudimental and analogic kind of methodologies, and draw my conclusions, try to understand what I want to say about that text and what that text says to me. So this is my basic methodology that I use for this type of texts. However, when you deal with journalistic texts, so with the range of different articles, the situation is different because you deal with different authors, you deal with texts that, especially in contemporary Italian journalism, reproducing, like, paste and copy each other quite a lot. So there are different dynamics, and for that I use the Envivo, for example, which is a qualitative data analysis software that helps you to do what they call coding, which is to put over there. You have a platform where you have all your articles, and what you can do is you would do manually. Is the classification, the coding. You can code different parts of the text according to categories that you establish in order to conduct your qualitative analysis. So that was particularly useful. What I try to do, even with my qualitative process, even my qualitative discourse analysis, is an analysis that has a lot to do with literary analysis. So that applies literary analysis, what we call the literary exegesis, to the text, the journalistic text. Of course, considering the differences, but it does have a lot to do with that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see Davide has his hand up.
Well, yes, I mean, thank you for this very, for this presentation, which has actually touched a lot of things that are just a couple of comments, which I think is important, in my opinion, and more than answers. One is the situated knowledge of Haraway implies a dimension, which is the ethical dimension, which I think it is very important for all different kinds of research. So we never have to forget the ethical dimension underlying our work, because we work with the social science, humanities, whatever, with all these things which have a kind of agency, because the way we represent things can actually determine the way we act. So I think this is very important. And a couple of things about one important things that came up in your discussion was the idea of objectivity, which is a central idea in journalistic study. What is objectivity? And maybe we could also say, what is reality? And I was thinking about Luhmann the reality, this bigger thinker of social system, the reality of mass media. So the mass media has, I think this is a kind of a long story of mass media, has a kind of one of the main aspects is normativity. So to impose a discourse, and we see this also by studying our sources from the past centuries. But what is interesting in these objectivities is that sometimes shit can happen. So, for example, in our sources, we see sometimes that even though for, let's say, 85% of the scores is about war, is about great figure, sometimes a woman, a kind of an underdog, somebody can show up in our discourse. So in our sources, and also sometimes also the women. So we have a lot of stories about women agency actually. So this is why it's important also to identify what kind of sources you are actually using in your work. And also, I think, only thing, I'm not that, I won't be that, you know, I agree with you about qualitative and quantitative and the tyranny of quantitative things, especially in certain fields. But I think that there are two levels. One is the level of a process, which give us how these things are, for my opinion, historically given and can change over time. And the other time is the event, when an event actually happen. And I think these two things are really interconnected. So I won't actually see these two things in opposition. And finally, well, nothing. I just I want to thank you for your very passionate and really for your presentation, for all the materials actually that you gave us to ponder upon. And I wanted just to say these two comments and leave the other if you wanna actually say something, or if there are other questions. I don't know. You know, we Italian, we don't really do questions. You know, we just.
I do passion a lot, but anyway, no, I kind of agree with everything you said, and I only want to say something about the imperative of the quantitative over the qualitative and whatever. I felt the need to point out that, because that's what I experienced as well, like in my peer review process, as I showed to you, but. I don't believe in dichotomies in general. Like, and I asked you to read Donna Haraway for a reason, and I didn't want with this talk to just promote qualitative analysis over quantitative analysis in an exclusive way. So they obviously can complement each other, but in my opinion, the qualitative process is necessary in order to avoid reductionism, in order to avoid simplification, and to allow complexities, which is particularly important, especially nowadays. That's everything.
I have a question, so to follow up. So, okay, fine. You say one of the problem with quantitative that we can make generalization, but they can actually ask you. But maybe one of the problem of qualitative is to do anecdotal things analysis. So how you actually deal with the anecdote and the generalization? Because one maybe of the critics that someone can actually do is that maybe the qualitative analysis, you can, if you don't grasp that thing in a context, which is the historical context, the societal context, and so on, maybe could also be seen as something that is not really representative, and also how you can infer an effect of this discourse on an audience, for example.
You're talking about the qualitative, no?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is a huge discussion, among scholars on this topic, because the idea of the possibility to generalize findings only when we deal with the certain type of quantitative analysis that imply, a huge corpus is highly discussed. Okay. Because of course, it implies a belief in statistics that is it might be problematic for somebody. But let's assume that should be the way. That, as I say, that qualitative analysis cannot be generalized, and quantitative sometimes can be generalized. Why is qualitative important if it cannot allow generalizations? I suppose this is the question. No, I think it is important because we live in a scientific community where. And that's why I made reference in the end to the idea of open research, where it's not only what is closed, what is definite, what is generalizable, and what describes as a whole the phenomenon that as importance. We live in a scientific community that is made by different contributions, qualitative different contributions that might allow us to form an idea that is never stable, that is open, of course, but I think it is also problematization that relies our capacity to understand reality.
I was just looking into the background of quantitative research, and I don't know if you know this, but there was a Journalistic Statistica published, I don't know exactly where, I think Rome, in 1909 and 1910. So a journal of Journalistic Statistica. E quindi, so I'm saying that this quantitative trend really goes back quite a long way. But I have Sara Mansuti has her hand up. And so I'm going to pass the word to her.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for your talk. And you were very generous to show also the work behind an article. I really appreciate it. I have a question about your PhD research. Did you find a difference between article published in printed newspaper and an article published in digital editions?
I included both.
Do you consider this aspect?
It was not something that I considered in detail, but of course I considered both. Okay, both articles, and to be honest, not much. There wasn't much difference. I don't have the numbers, okay, but no. Not much difference. Many times it happens that even printed journalists do the same work of paste and copy that online journalists do. I had the unfortunate of working for a while as an online journalist in Italy, and yes, and I can confirm that is the reproduction of the reproduction of ANSA's news, and ANSA's news was a pretty kind of
in this case, have you considered the article if it is only a copy of the ANSA?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
I did, because that was just, apart from my research being qualitative in general, in my PhD dissertation is exclusively qualitative. Then I had to add the quantitative dimension in the article because I was required to do so. And in that case, I had to ask myself the question: do I include this in the total, in the compute, or not? Or not? So I decided to do, because still it counts as an article, in terms of people who have access to that, that has an amplified access. It's not only published by one newspaper on one platform. So yes, I did.
Thank you.
Very good. It's a hard decision sometimes, how much we want to change our work in regard to the publishing opportunity that may come our way. So actually, I have to bring our formal proceedings to a close, although some of us, I think, may stay on to chat for a few minutes, but we can release those who have to get somewhere because our time is really up. But let me thank Nicoletta very much for this lovely talk and for your interventions afterwards and for the conversation that you've given us. And we'll be looking forward to meeting again. And let me remind our listeners, our participants, that we have yet another conversation coming up in February. So stay tuned. And remember to consult www.euronews.org. So thank you very much, everyone.